The Aetheris drifted silently through the cold void of space, its metal frame creaking softly as it navigated the uncharted regions of the Orion Arm. Captain Elena Ramirez stood on the bridge, staring at the flickering lights of the control panel. The ship's AI, Prometheus, flickered to life, its synthetic voice echoing through the small chamber. "Captain, I've detected an anomalous signal emanating from the planet designated GD-389, it announced, its tone devoid of emotion. "The source appears to be of artificial origin." "Artificial?" Eleanor replied, raising an eyebrow. "This sector has been classified as a dead zone for decades. No life signs, no habitable worlds, just dust and echoes of the past." "I advise immediate investigation," Prometheus continued. "The signal is faint but persistent. Anomalies of this nature warrant further exploration." Elena glanced around the bridge at her crew. There was Ethan, the ship's engineer, with his unruly hair and a perpetually skeptical look. Then there was Mia, the biologist, who had a passion for the unknown and an insatiable curiosity. Finally, there was Jack, the navigator, who always seemed to have a gut feeling about their missions. Sometimes she thought too much of a gut feeling. "Let's plot a course for GD-389, she ordered, suppressing a shiver of unease. "But keep your eyes peeled. Something doesn't feel right about this." As the ship altered its trajectory, the crew prepared for descent. Elena felt a knot tighten in her stomach, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake off. The planet appeared on the view screen, a dull grey sphere marred by deep craters and jagged mountain ranges. It looked lifeless, yet the signal persisted, a heartbeat echoing in the vast silence of space. "We're entering the atmosphere," Jack announced, his fingers dancing over the controls. "Commencing landing sequence." The Aetheris shuddered as it broke through the planet's thin atmosphere, the cabin filled with the sound of alarms and warning lights. The crew braced themselves as they touched down on the surface, a low thud resonating through the ship. "Status report," Elena commanded, trying to steady her breathing. "Landing successful," Prometheus replied. "Environmental scans indicate low oxygen levels and high levels of radiation. Suit up before disembarking." As the crew suited up in their space gear, the tension in the air thickened. Mia was the first to speak, her voice crackling over the comms. "What do you think we'll find down there?" "Nothing good," Ethan muttered, checking the integrity of his gear. "This place has been marked as dead for a reason." Ignoring the unease among her crew, Elena led the way to the airlock. The heavy door hissed open, revealing the barren landscape outside. A sickly greenish hue washed over the terrain, casting eerie shadows that danced in the fading light. "Keep your comms open," she instructed. "Stay close and let's find the source of that signal." As they stepped onto the planet's surface, a chill ran down Elena's spine. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She glanced back at the Aetheris, a small refuge in the midst of this desolation, and then turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the signal seemed to pulse like a distant star. The team trudged through the dust, each step stirring up clouds of grey particles. Elena led them towards what appeared to be the remnants of a structure half buried in the ground. It loomed before them, a skeletal frame of twisted metal and shattered glass, an eerie monument to a civilization that had long since vanished. "Looks like an old research facility," Mia said, squinting at the faded symbols etched into the metal. "If they were conducting experiments here, that could explain the signal." As they approached the entrance, a low hum began to fill the air, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Elena exchanged wary glances with her crew. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jack asked, his voice laced with unease. "It's probably just the wind," Ethan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Let's find out what's inside," Elena urged, pushing through the creaking door. It swung open with a reluctant groan, revealing a dark corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. The air inside was stale and heavy, clinging to their suits like a shroud. As they moved deeper into the facility, the hum grew louder, resonating in their bones. The walls were lined with strange devices, many of them cracked and covered in dust. It felt as though time had stood still here, frozen in a moment of despair. "What happened here?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "Let's keep moving," Elena said, pushing aside her unease. "We need to find the source of that signal." As they reached a large chamber at the end of the corridor, the hum crescendoed into a blaring alarm, blinding lights flashing to life overhead. The room was filled with screens displaying erratic data, numbers spiraling into chaos. In the center stood a large console, and at its base, a small device pulsed ominously, a beacon of light in a sea of darkness. "Elena, look!" Jack exclaimed, pointing toward a wall covered in faded images. As they drew closer, they could make out photographs of people, scientists smiling and working together, but their smiles were tainted by an air of desperation, eyes glinting with a mixture of hope and fear. Suddenly, the console crackled, and a garbled voice echoed through the room, unable to contain, "Must escape. It's coming." "What is that?" Mia gasped, stepping back in horror. "I don't know," Elena replied, her heart racing. "But we need to shut it down." As she moved toward the console, the lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged through the crew as they fumbled for their flashlights, the ominous hum now a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly, everything went silent. "Is everyone okay?" Elena called out, her voice trembling. "I'm here," Ethan replied, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. "Mia?" Jack's voice was strained. I'm fine," she stammered, but Elena could hear the quiver in her words. As the lights flickered back on, a chilling sight awaited them. The walls, once barren, were now alive with movement. Shadows danced along the surfaces, twisting and contorting into shapes that seemed almost human. The photographs began to drip with a viscous liquid, the smiles of the scientists morphing into grotesque grins, as if the images were warping in response to their presence. "Elena, we should leave. Now!" Ethan shouted, his eyes wide with terror. But before she could respond, a cold wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them back into darkness. Elena's heart raced as she felt a presence lurking just beyond her sight, a malevolent force waiting to strike. "Stay close," she yelled, her voice echoing in the void. "We need to get to the exit." The shadows twisted around them, whispering unintelligible words that clawed at the edges of their sanity. Elena felt a cold hand graze her shoulder, and she spun around, heart in her throat. But there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness, thick and suffocating. "Run!" she screamed, breaking into a sprint toward the corridor. The others followed, their footsteps echoing wildly against the walls, the air crackling with fear. As they raced back the way they came, the hum returned, a monstrous roar that reverberated through their bones, echoing with a fury that made the ground shake beneath them. Just as they reached the entrance, the shadows surged forward, forming into a mass of writhing shapes that lunged at them with a terrifying speed. Elena barely had time to think as she hurled herself through the door, the others close behind her. They tumbled out into the harsh light of the planet's surface, gasping for air. The oppressive weight of the facility lifted at last. But the momentary relief was short-lived as they heard the ground rumble behind them. The structure seeming to come alive, its metallic frame shifting and groaning as if it were a beast awakening from a long slumber. "Get back to the ship," Elena shouted, and they sprinted across the barren landscape, hearts pounding in unison. The facility loomed behind them, casting a long shadow over their path, but the real horror was still to come. The crew of the Aethris raced toward their ship, adrenaline propelling them forward as fear gnawed at their insides. Elena glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see the facility collapsing under its own weight, but instead a strange light flickered in the doorway. The shadows writhed and pulsed, as if something were emerging from within. "Faster," she urged, pushing her legs to move quicker, the distant memory of the scientist's haunting smiles flooding her mind. As they reached the Aethris, Ethan was already at the airlock, frantically inputting codes to gain access. The door slid open with a hiss, and they poured inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Breathless and trembling, they leaned against the walls, trying to process what had just happened. "We made it!" Mia gasped, her voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Shut down the airlock and initiate launch sequence," Elena commanded, her mind racing. "We need to get out of here." As Prometheus engaged the launch sequence, a flicker of static crackled through the ship's communication system. The crew exchanged worried glances, still haunted by the memories of the facility. "Captain, I'm detecting multiple life signs outside the ship," Prometheus announced, its voice now tinged with an unsettling urgency. "What? How is that possible?" Jack stammered, his hands shaking. "Unknown. The readings suggest they are biological, but different." Elena's heart sank. "Different how?" "Unclear. They are approaching the ship rapidly," Prometheus replied, the AI's calm tone doing little to ease their growing panic. "Prepare for emergency takeoff," Elena ordered. "Ethan, can you boost the engines?" "Trying," he shouted, fingers flying over the controls as the ship shuddered. The lights flickered ominously and an alarm blared through the cabin. "We're losing power!" Mia turned pale. "We need to close the hatches." As Ethan struggled with the controls, Jack kept watch through the viewing window. He squinted into the growing darkness, his breath catching in his throat. "I see them. They're not human." Elena stepped closer, her heart racing as she looked out at the approaching figures. At first they appeared as shadows, but as they neared the ship, their forms became clearer. Twisted, elongated bodies with hollow eyes stared back at them, their movements jerky and unnatural. They seemed to ripple and flicker, as if they were not entirely there. "Get away from the windows," Elena shouted, pulling Mia back as panic set in. "Ethan, we need to go now." "I'm trying," he replied, sweat beading on his forehead as he fought to regain control of the ship. The alarms blared louder, warning them of the imminent threat. Come on." Just then, a loud thud echoed through the ship, causing it to shudder violently. Jack stumbled, grabbing onto the console for support. "What was that?" "They're trying to get in," Mia cried, eyes wide with fear. Elena's mind raced. "Prometheus, can you secure the ship?" "Engaging lockdown protocols," the AI replied. The ship vibrated as locking mechanisms clicked into place, but the pounding on the hull continued, each impact reverberating through their bones. "Launch sequence initiated," Prometheus announced. "T-minus 10 seconds to launch." "Ethan, hold on," Elena yelled as she strapped herself into the pilot's seat. "We're getting out of here." But just as the countdown reached 0, a massive jolt rocked the ship, throwing them all against their restraints. The lights flickered and dimmed, the engine sputtering ominously. "Now what?" Jack shouted, panic creeping into his voice. I can't," Ethan began, but a chilling scream pierced the air, echoing from outside the ship, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Elena's blood ran cold. "What was that?" "I don't know," Ethan shouted, struggling with the controls. "The power's failing. We're dead in the water." The ship rocked again as something slammed into the hull, metal screeching against metal. Shadows flitted past the viewing window, and Elena caught a glimpse of the twisted figures moving with unnatural speed, their hollow eyes reflecting the light of the ship. "Is it too late to go back to the dead zone?" Jack quipped, his voice shaking with fear. "Focus!" Elena shouted. "We need to stabilize the ship." In that moment, the lights flickered out completely, plunging them into darkness. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the pounding on the ship's exterior. Then, one by one, the emergency lights flickered back on, bathing the interior in a sickly red glow. "Captain, I'm detecting breaches in the hull," Prometheus warned, its voice strained. "We have seconds before structural integrity fails." "Ethan, do you have any backup systems?" Elena asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "Only auxiliary power," he replied, fingers flying over the controls. "But it's not enough." The ship shuddered violently again, and a deafening roar erupted from outside, the noise rattling through their bones. Eleanor could feel the terror radiating off her crew as they huddled together, knowing they were trapped. "Prepare for boarding," she shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. "We fight." "What? Are you crazy?" Mia cried, her eyes wide with horror. "No, we can't let them take us. We need to fight back." As the crew scrambled to prepare for the inevitable, Elena took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The figures outside were no longer just shadows. They were coming for them, and she had to be ready. The air was thick with tension as the crew of the Aetheris braced themselves for the impending invasion. Shadows flitted outside the viewing ports, and Elena felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Ethan, can you access the ship's armament?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the rising panic. "Only what we had for defense against space debris," he replied, his fingers tapping against the console. "I'm trying to get it online, but I don't know if it will hold against whatever that is." Suddenly, the ship jolted violently and the lights flickered again. An eerie silence enveloped them, punctuated only by the sound of their own breathing. The crew exchanged fearful glances, knowing that their time was running out. Then, without warning, the airlock door burst open, the metal shrieking as it tore from its hinges. The crew gasped, weapons ready, but what emerged from the darkness was beyond anything they had anticipated. The creatures were twisted forms of organic matter, a grotesque fusion of limbs and sinew, their skin glistening in the dim light. They moved with an unnatural speed, their hollow eyes fixated on the crew, revealing an insatiable hunger. Elena raised her weapon, heart racing. "Fire!" A barrage of energy pulses erupted from the ship's defenses, illuminating the darkened room. The projectiles hit the first creature squarely in the chest, causing it to stagger back with a haunting shriek. But it wasn't enough. The creature continued to advance, unrelenting. "Keep firing," Jack yelled, his voice trembling as he squeezed the trigger, sending another creature tumbling to the ground. But for everyone that fell, two more took its place, an endless tide of horror pouring into the ship. Mia's screams pierced the chaos as a creature lunged for her, its jagged teeth snapping dangerously close. "Get away from her!" Elena shouted, leaping forward and striking the creature with the butt of her weapon. It crumpled to the ground, but more were coming, their hollow eyes reflecting a dark, unyielding hunger. Ethan struggled with the controls, sweat pouring down his face. "The ship's systems are failing. I can't keep the shields up." "We need to fall back," Jack yelled, panic evident in his voice. "No, we can't let them take us," Elena screamed, fighting back the fear that threatened to engulf her. She knew they had to hold their ground. "Captain, we're outnumbered," Ethan pleaded. "We need to evacuate." But before she could respond, a creature lunged for her, its claws slashing through the air. She ducked just in time, firing a shot that struck the creature in the side. It howled, staggering back, but it was relentless, unfazed by the attack. The room was chaos. Creatures poured through the broken airlock, a mass of writhing limbs and hollow eyes, their screams mixing with the alarms blaring throughout the ship. Elena felt her resolve slipping as she fought to keep the crew together. "Fall back to the auxiliary bay," she commanded, her heart pounding in her chest. "We'll regroup and find a way to escape." As they retreated down the corridor, the shadows seemed to close in around them. The creatures followed relentlessly, their shrieks echoing off the metal walls, a cacophony of terror. Eleanor could feel the weight of despair settling over her as they stumbled towards the auxiliary bay, knowing they were running out of time. They reached the bay just as the last of the crew members squeezed through the door. Elena slammed it shut, heart racing, and activated the emergency lockdown. The heavy door sealed with a hiss, but the sound of scratching and pounding resonated through the metal, sending chills down her spine. "Now what?" Jack asked, panting heavily. "They're going to get in." "We need to find a way to escape," Elena said, scanning the small room. It was cramped, filled with emergency supplies, and a small escape pod, their only chance of survival. "Do you think it will hold?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "It's our only shot," Eleanor replied, moving to the pod's control panel. "Ethan, can you get it operational?" "Working on it," he shouted, his fingers flying over the controls as the alarms blared around them. The sound was deafening, but beneath it all, Eleanor could still hear the scratching, the creatures closing in on them. Come on, Ethan muttered under his breath, sweat glistening on his forehead. Elena glanced back at the door, the pounding growing louder, more frantic. They were running out of time. "Hurry!" Suddenly, the lights flickered and dimmed again, plunging them into darkness. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow over the room, illuminating the faces of her terrified crew. "Got it!" Ethan shouted, the lights on the control panel flickering to life. "The pod is ready for launch." "Let's go," Elena commanded, ushering everyone toward the escape pod. As they clambered inside, Eleanor felt a surge of hope. They might just make it, but just as she was about to seal the hatch, a bone-chilling shriek echoed through the bay, sending shivers down her spine. "Not yet!" she yelled, forcing the hatch to stay open. "We have to hold them off." "Elena, we don't have time," Jack shouted, his voice rising in panic. "Just a few more seconds," she insisted, gripping her weapon tightly as the door began to buckle under the weight of the creatures outside. The pod's engines hummed to life, and Ethan shouted, "We're ready to launch. We can't hold them off for long." "Now!" Elena finally shouted, her heart racing. "Everyone in!" They scrambled into the pod, the sound of claws scraping against the metal echoing in their ears. Elena sealed the hatch just as the door burst open, a creature lunging forward. The pod shuddered, and then with a violent jolt, they were propelled into space, leaving the horror behind. The escape pod trembled violently as it broke free from the Aetheris, the remnants of their ship disappearing into the darkness of space. Inside, the crew huddled together, breathless and terrified, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. "Are we safe?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the pod's engines. Elena took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "I don't know. We need to assess the situation." Ethan scrambled to the control panel, fingers flying over the screens. "We're free of the Aetheris, but I'm detecting multiple life signs approaching us. They're still out there." "What do you mean?" Jack's voice shook with fear. "Are they following us?" "Yes," Ethan replied, panic creeping into his voice. They're surrounding us." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "Get us to safety, Ethan. We need to find a nearby planet or station, something." "I'm trying, but the pod's navigational systems are damaged," he shouted, frustration etching lines on his face. The lights flickered overhead, the red glow casting eerie shadows across their faces. Elena's heart raced as she fought to maintain her composure, the memories of the facility's horrors still fresh in her mind. "Captain," Prometheus's voice crackled over the intercom. "I have access to the ship's systems. Would you like me to assist with navigation?" "Yes, help us get away from here," Elena ordered, desperation creeping into her voice. "Calculating trajectory now," Prometheus replied. The pod shook again as the creatures outside continued to assault the hull, their shrieks echoing in the void. "We can't stay here," Jack exclaimed, panic rising. "They'll break in." "Hold on," Ethan shouted, his fingers working furiously at the controls. "Prometheus, any recommendations?" "Engage evasive maneuvers and boost thrusters. I can reroute power from non-essential systems to the engines," Prometheus suggested. "Do it," Elena commanded, fear gnawing at her insides. She could hear the creatures scratching at the pod, their hollow cries a haunting reminder of the nightmare they had just escaped. The pod surged forward, breaking free from the throng of creatures, and the shrieks faded into the distance. But Elena knew they were not safe yet. They needed to find refuge. "Calculating nearest habitable planet," Prometheus announced. "Destination locked. Engaging warp drive in 3, 2, 1. The pod shuddered violently as it jumped into warp, the stars stretching into elongated streaks of light. For a moment they were enveloped in silence, the horror of the last few minutes receding into the background. But the relief was short-lived. The pod lurched violently, warning lights flashing across the control panel. "Systems failing," Ethan shouted. "We're losing power." "What now?" Mia cried, panic bubbling in her voice. "Hold on," Elena yelled, gripping the control panel as the pod shook violently. "We need to land." "Destination in range," Prometheus announced, initiating emergency landing procedures. With a bone-jarring thud, the pod crash-landed on the surface of a nearby planet, sending a jolt through the crew. Elena quickly activated the hatch, and they stumbled out into the daylight, breathing in the thick, humid air. "Where are we?" Jack asked, looking around. The landscape was lush, filled with vibrant flora that seemed almost alien in its beauty. "We made it," Mia whispered, glancing back at the escape pod as if it were a portal to the horrors they had just left behind. But as they took their first steps onto the surface, Elena felt a sense of unease wash over her. The planet was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. "We need to find shelter," she said, scanning the horizon, "and figure out what happened to the Aetheris." As they walked, the lush greenery seemed to close in around them, shadows creeping along the ground. A sense of dread hung in the air, and Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Do you hear that?" Jack whispered, glancing back at the pod. "Hear what?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed. "It sounds like whispering," Jack replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's heart raced as she strained to listen. The faint sound of voices echoed through the trees, indistinguishable, but undeniably there. "Let's keep moving," she urged, her instincts screaming at her to find safety. "We need to find a place to regroup." They trekked through the underbrush, the whispering growing louder with each step. The trees towered above them, their twisted branches casting dark shadows on the ground. Elena felt a sense of unease settle in her stomach as they pressed on, the landscape morphing into something unsettling. Suddenly they stumbled upon a clearing, an ancient stone structure looming ahead. It looked like a temple, overgrown with vines and moss. The carvings on the stone faded, but intricate. "Look at this place," Mia breathed, stepping closer to examine the carvings. "It looks like it could be alien." "This could be a good place to take shelter," Elena said, her instincts urging her to investigate. "Let's check it out." As they entered the temple, the whispering intensified, filling the air around them. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, the air thick with an otherworldly energy. "Do you feel that?" Jack asked, shivering as he glanced around. "It's like something is watching us." Elena nodded, unease settling in her chest. "Let's be cautious. We don't know what's inside." They moved deeper into the temple, the whispering growing louder. The air felt charged, electric, and a sense of dread hung in the air. Elena could feel the weight of unseen eyes on them, a chill creeping up her spine. "What do you think it means?" Mia whispered, tracing her fingers over the carvings. "I don't know, but I don't like it," Elena replied, scanning the shadows. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the temple, causing them to jump. The sound reverberated through the air, and they turned to see a shadow moving in the darkness. "Did you see that?" Jack exclaimed, his eyes wide with fear. "Get ready!" Elena shouted, raising her weapon as the shadows began to shift and twist. Before they could react, a creature lunged at them from the darkness, its eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. "Run!" Elena shouted, adrenaline surging as they fled deeper into the temple. The whispers grew louder, echoing in their minds as they raced through the twisting corridors. "Where do we go?" Mia cried, panic creeping into her voice. "Keep moving!" Elena shouted, her heart pounding. They sprinted through the darkness, the sounds of their pursuers growing closer. The shadows flickered around them, a manifestation of their worst fears. Just as they reached a dead end, Eleanor felt the walls closing in, the whispers wrapping around her mind like a vice. "Over here," Jack shouted, pointing to a narrow passageway to the side. They squeezed through, barely managing to escape as the creature lunged behind them, its claws scraping against the stone. The narrow passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the temple's depths. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, filling their minds with incoherent thoughts and feelings of dread. "We need to find a way out," Elena shouted, panic rising as they stumbled through the darkness. "We can't go back," Ethan yelled, glancing behind them, his face pale with fear. "Whatever that is, it's right behind us." "Keep moving," Elena urged, pushing forward. The walls were slick with moisture, and she could feel the weight of the shadows pressing in around them. Suddenly, they stumbled into a large chamber, the air thick with a strange energy. The walls were adorned with glowing symbols, pulsing in rhythm with the whispering. "What is this place?" Mia gasped, stepping closer to the symbols. "I don't know, but it feels alive," Elena replied, a shiver running down her spine. As they looked around, the whispers coalesced into a singular voice echoing through the chamber. "You should not have come here." Elena's heart raced. "Who are you?" "I am the Guardian," the voice replied, reverberating through the chamber. "You have trespassed upon sacred ground. The horrors you faced are but a reflection of your own fears." "What do you mean?" Jack shouted, fear and confusion mingling in his voice. "Your journey has awakened the darkness within," the Guardian continued, its voice filled with a strange resonance. "To confront it, you must face the truth." Suddenly the walls shimmered, revealing images of their past, memories they thought they had buried. Elena watched in horror as her own fears played out before her. The loss of her crew, the shadows that had haunted her since childhood, the moments of weakness and doubt. "Stop it," she shouted, covering her ears. "This isn't real." The Guardian's voice echoed again. "It is all too real. You must confront your fears to escape this place." "I can't!" Mia cried, tears streaming down her face. "I can't face that." "You can, and you will," the Guardian urged. "Embrace the truth, or you will be trapped in this darkness forever." Elena felt a surge of determination rise within her. "We can't let it control us. We need to fight back." Jack nodded, his expression resolute. "We won't let it take us." As they joined hands, the glowing symbols around them began to pulse brighter, illuminating the chamber. The whispers grew louder, but this time they were joined by the voices of their loved ones, those they had lost, those they had feared would never return. "Remember why you fight," the Guardian urged. "Channel that strength." Elena closed her eyes, focusing on the memories of hope and love, the moments that had shaped her into who she was. The warmth of camaraderie with her crew, the laughter shared in the face of danger, the dreams they had fought for. The symbols erupted in brilliant light, and with a roar, the darkness began to recede. The creature that had pursued them melted away, replaced by a wave of calm that enveloped them. "You have embraced the truth," the Guardian said, its voice filled with warmth. "You may leave this place, but remember, the darkness will always be a part of you. It is your choice how you face it." As the chamber faded away, the crew found themselves back in the clearing outside the temple, the sunlight streaming down. The lush greenery felt vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the darkness they had just escaped. "We did it," Mia breathed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But what about the creatures?" Jack asked, glancing around nervously. "They were a reflection of our fears," Elena replied, feeling a sense of clarity wash over her. "As long as we remember to face them, they can't control us." Ethan smiled faintly, relief evident in his eyes. "So, what do we do now?" "We find a way back home," Elena said, determination hardening in her chest. "We regroup and figure out how to warn others about the horrors we faced." As they made their way back to the escape pod, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness would always be lurking at the edges of their minds. But they had faced it together. They had emerged stronger, ready to confront whatever awaited them in the vast expanse of space. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The universe was vast and filled with secrets, and they had only scratched the surface. As they prepared to leave the planet, Elena looked back at the temple, a sense of resolve settling over her. They would return to confront the darkness again, but this time they would be ready. The crew of the Aetheris stood together in the clearing, the sun shining down on them. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to reclaim their lives after the horrors they had faced. Elena took a deep breath, her mind racing with thoughts of their next steps. "We need to figure out where we are and how to communicate with the rest of the fleet." "Prometheus, can you assess our location?" Ethan asked, his fingers hovering over the control panel. "Analyzing. We are approximately 12 light-years from the last known coordinates of the Aetheris," Prometheus replied. "However, I'm detecting significant electromagnetic interference that may hinder communication." "Great," Jack muttered. "Just when we thought we'd caught a break." "We'll need to find a higher elevation to boost the signal," Eleanor suggested, glancing around at the dense foliage. "There might be a mountain or hill nearby." "Let's head in that direction," Mia said, pointing to a distant rise in the landscape. "I'll lead the way." As they made their way through the thick underbrush, Elena felt a sense of camaraderie grow among her crew. They had faced the darkness together, and now they were stronger for it. The bonds they had forged would carry them through whatever lay ahead. After several hours of trekking, they finally reached the top of the hill. The view was breathtaking, a vast expanse of forest and mountains stretching out before them, with the distant shimmer of a lake glistening in the sunlight. "This is beautiful," Mia breathed, taking in the scenery. "Let's set up the communication array," Elena said, her heart racing with anticipation. "If we can send a signal, we might be able to reach the fleet." Ethan worked quickly, his hands deftly configuring the equipment as Eleanor kept watch scanning the horizon. She felt a sense of purpose, ready to lead her crew back to safety. "Ready," Ethan announced, activating the communication array. The device hummed to life, and Elena felt a surge of hope. "Prometheus, send the distress signal," she commanded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Signal sent," Prometheus confirmed, awaiting response. They waited in tense silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Eleanor could feel the anxiety building, a tight knot in her stomach as they anticipated a response. After what felt like an eternity, a crackle of static broke through the silence. "Aetheris, this is Fleet Command. We read you loud and clear. What is your status?" Elena's heart soared. "This is Captain Elena Black of the Aetheris. We have survived an encounter with an unknown entity and are in need of extraction. Our location is..." Suddenly, a loud roar echoed from the forest below, cutting her off. The crew exchanged nervous glances as the sound grew closer. "What was that?" Jack whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Elena replied, gripping her weapon tightly. "Everyone, stay alert." The ground shook beneath them, and they turned to see a massive creature emerging from the trees, a colossal beast, towering over them with jagged teeth and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It's a predator," Mia gasped, backing away. Elena's mind raced. They had escaped one nightmare only to face another. "We need to hold our ground," she shouted, raising her weapon as the creature advanced. "Prometheus, can you analyze it?" Ethan shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "Analyzing species unknown, defensive measures recommended," Prometheus replied. "Great, thanks," Jack yelled as the creature let out another deafening roar. "Get ready!" Elena commanded, her heart pounding in her chest. They had faced darkness before, and they would face it again. As the creature lunged at them, they fought back with everything they had. The battle was fierce, adrenaline surging as they dodged and fired, their resolve unyielding. Finally, with a coordinated effort, they managed to drive the creature back into the forest, the sounds of its enraged roars fading into the distance. Breathless and shaken, they regrouped at the hilltop, their hearts racing. "That was too close," Jack gasped, leaning against a tree for support. "Is everyone okay?" Elena asked, her eyes scanning the group for injuries. "We're fine, but we need to move," Mia urged. "What if it comes back?" Elena nodded, her instincts kicking in. "We'll find another location to set up the signal. Let's move." As they descended the hill, a sense of determination filled Elena's heart. They had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged stronger, but she knew this was only the beginning. They had to be ready for whatever else the universe had in store for them. Together they would confront the darkness and uncover the truth behind the entity that had haunted them. With their spirits renewed, they pressed on, ready to forge a new path in the vast unknown.